in cities all around the nation and indeed all around the world, and that includes here in Houston. Last week, we joined with the Floyd family as they had the incredibly difficult task of grieving their beloved George and laying him to rest in front of the world. But they vowed to find justice for him, and it's a conversation we continue to have too, as his death brings to the forefront so many issues that we don't often deal with, not directly. And now there is another family grieving the loss of their loved one, a 27-year-old father of 4 who was shot by police in Atlanta after he was found asleep in his car. Just the latest death in a long and very tragic list. And that brings us to tonight. We want to take a look at the role of communities of faith and what they have to say in this very urgent conversation about race, social justice, and relationships with the police. And we have an incredibly distinguished panel of guests joining us here tonight, so I want to take a chance to go ahead and introduce everybody. I'd like to begin with Pastor Steve Wells, who is pastor of South Main Baptist Church, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo with the Galveston-Houston Archdiocese, Pastors Remus Wright and co-pastor Mia Wright at the Fountain of Praise, there they both are, the Rev Bill Lawson, pastor emeritus at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, Rabbi David Lyon with Congregation Beth Israel, and our sheriff, the Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez, Imam Tauqeer Shah with the Islamic Society of Greater Houston. And I want to thank everybody for being here, first of all. Now, we got a big crowd of clergy people and one elected official, and that means we've all got a lot to say, and I want to get to you as quickly as I can. And I'm going to begin here with Pastor Wells. And Pastor Wells, we had a chance to see you last week at the funeral, but we have all heard the saying that the most segregated hour of the week is Sunday morning when people go to their individual churches. In many cases where everybody looks just like them, whites go to white churches, blacks go to black churches, and so on. But you were pretty blunt when you spoke at the funeral last week when you said that more white churches need to get involved in the battle against systemic racism, and especially when we see these terrible cases of police brutality against people of color. So I want to start off just by asking you, why were you so adamant about that? Why was that so important to you?
Because it's so wrong. I think somehow we have chosen to accept as normal just what you said, that there are white churches and black churches and Hispanic churches and Asian churches. And I understand historically where that comes from. We used to all have one mass and it was in Latin. And then somebody got the bright idea that we should be able to worship in our own heart languages. And so there were German churches and French churches and English churches. And then it kept dividing out until that felt normal. We've lost the idea that it's all part of the same church, that it doesn't feel right and normal to be in each other's services. And I think until we reclaim that biblical promise that in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free, that we haven't become one church. I think what George Floyd's death set off in us was just to see how far we've truly come when a person could be that casual and that callous in taking someone's life. But when a person doesn't recognize the image of God alive before him, that there's a work for the church to do to call us back into living in God's world and God's ways. So I thought if we're going to start, we should start with us. We should confess what we have done wrong, and we should seek ways to do right.
Well, but how do you do that? How do you get more churches, white churches involved? How do you get more members in your church involved, especially when the message is Black Lives Matter?
It's interesting. Black Lives Matter is the first civil rights group that didn't start in the church. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's some tension because the message of Black Lives Matter doesn't sound like the civil rights message. There's a distinction there. How do we get our folks involved? I think we do the slow work of building relationships. Our church at South Main is intentionally building a partnership with the Church Without Walls. We've had a long-standing partnership with Pleasant Hill Baptist Church. Of course, South Main and Wheeler Avenue go way back together. Yeah. So you start the work of individuals building relationships with people who don't look like them and don't think like them and don't vote like them. We have a common humanity in that. So we're committed to, in small groups, getting people together and taking time to do that, and do that for a couple of things, not just for racial reconciliation, but also then to let these protests turn into policy to affect real change in the way the world works. And then beyond that is a statement of Christian unity, that we've come together because we are one in Christ.
Yeah, and you remind me once again of that long-standing relationship, as you mentioned, with our church, with Wheeler Avenue. I want to go to the Wrights right now, if I could. And you all made the really generous decision to hold George Floyd's funeral at your church, even in the midst of a pandemic, even though many of your own members were not allowed to attend your services for months. You've been doing virtually like most other churches. But why did you decide to do that? Why did you open your doors, if you will, to everyone to hold that funeral there? And were you criticized about it?
Well, Melanie, we decided to do it because one of George Floyd's family members is a member of our congregation, and we take death very seriously in our church. We feel that if you can't be with your people in the time of loss and the time of grief, well, they're really, you really shouldn't have a church at all. So initially it was because we saw the grief and the astonishment and the sorrow that this family was facing. But more than that, I think it spiraled into knowing that we should be in support of them, not only emotionally and spiritually, but in terms of justice and reform. We felt like that, we wanted to be a part of the process of change, because when we noticed what happened with George, we said we cannot continue to sit on the sidelines and just let this happen.
Yeah.
You asked Melanie if we, in fact, have been criticized by it. We actually have not heard much critical review of it. Actually, most people saw the compassion that was there. They saw the spirit of excellence that our team worked to make sure that the safety and protocols that needed to be in place during this season of COVID was in place as well. And most people saw the fact that, we were standing in with other leaders to say that, yeah, it's time for our nation to make a change, but also to serve not just our community, or not just the family in terms of healing, but to serve the community to start the process of healing.
Well, and Pastor Mia, one of the things that I was really struck by was obviously the diversity of people who showed up, especially for the viewing the day before the funeral. And you made the deliberate decision to invite Pastor Wells to come in and speak and to talk about race. Why was that important as part of that search, to bring up the entire issue of race?
Because, we wanted to show diversity. We wanted to also show that the problem that happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis is a problem that is happening all over the country. And if we are to do something about it, we must do it as a unified front. There must be people from all walks of life, every color, every creed, every religion. We have to join together. And this is an issue that is plaguing our nation. And the only way that we could see any kind of change occur is that we bring people in that have questions or that can have the conversation. That's the reason why, we have the iconic Bill Lawson in, because, he's been a civil rights leader in this city for many, 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 many years. I didn't have his phone number, so I asked Bishop Dickson to call him for me, but I wanted him to be there. We wanted Steve Wells to be there. Had I known Cardinal DiNardo, I would have had him there. I'd had Rabbi Lyon there. I'd have had Imam Shah there. I would have had, of course, the sheriff was there. But we wanted everybody to be there to be a part of the conversation, that this has got to change. And the only way it can change, all of those of us who are people of faith must join together to make this happen.
Well, and I want to come back to that in just a few moments, but I'd like to move on to the Cardinal right now. And Cardinal DiNardo, the Catholic Church has been diverse since its inception, and certainly that is the case here in Houston, in the Houston area. In fact, I looked it up, and I think you've got 1.7 million Catholics in this area out of more than 6 million people, so almost a third, which is just amazing. But diverse doesn't always mean open, and certainly not about issues like race and discrimination. So I wanted to kind of refer to something you wrote just recently in the Catholic News. And first you quoted scripture, of course, and you said, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." And that's Matthew 7:5. And then you went on to say that plainly stated, for it is plain to see, we in America have a plank in our eye with regard to racism. It is a tough but necessary reality to confront because we cannot address a problem until we acknowledge it. And then this was the key part. You said in the past, leaders of the church frequently refrain from speaking out when acts of racial violence or other injustices have come to light. No more is what you wrote. So that's my question for you. What does that mean? What happens now within the Catholic Church here in our area and on a wider scale?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here this evening with all these other distinguished leaders. I keep thinking of Reverend Lawson, who was such a deep, deep friend of my predecessor, Archbishop Fiorenza. I think the first things that we're doing as a church, and we have to do rightfully so, is we have to grieve. Just as we gathered last week and saw a family in grief, we could grieve with them, because if you don't grieve, you have no sympathy or compassion. Within our church, that's a very important dimension, because we too claim, not only claim, we believe, every human being is made in the image and likeness of God. When something happens that's wrong, we grieve with the family and with that person. When that person's life is taken from them, we have to respond in grief, in prayer, and then we have to go to action. In my own archdiocese, my Archdiocesan Pastoral Council, we call them, have been meeting for months, looking at actions and possibilities we can do to overcome this plank that we have in our eyes a lot, that is racism. It can be done with a gesture or an action that's unspeaking. We need to be attentive and to listen. So part of our project of doing this is listening, most especially listening to our Black and Hispanic brothers and sisters within our community.
Well, Cardinal, I really want to press you on this because I don't get to Mass very often, but certainly one of the things that I've heard from many of my Catholic friends is that often this is not an issue that's brought up, for instance, by the priest as he is delivering, is it the homily? I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Right, sure.
At service. And is that something you're going to say to many of your priests now, that it's important that you talk about this issue? It is important that we show how important it is to us in the Catholic Church?
Sure, and in fact, I've spoken about this before, but I will continue to speak about this as we go along. Yes, our homilies are based on lectionary readings, so we read from the Scripture. Mm-hmm. In any case, any week is a good week to talk about the human person and the rights and the dignity and justice that is owed them. So within our structure of homilies on Sundays, yes, that's one of the things we have to pay close attention to and do.
All right. Thank you so much, Cardinal. Well, Rabbi Lyon, I wonder if I can take a moment with you now. And you and I have talked about this in the past. I know we have, but there's long been an almost symbiotic relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community when it came to fighting against discrimination. Certainly the sit-ins and the marches of the civil rights movement, there were many Jews involved. And in fact, in some cases, they also suffered and died or were killed for their stance. But I have to ask, there seems to be now a little bit less involvement or maybe open involvement by the Jewish community in our area. And of course, we know there's oftentimes been tension between Jews and Blacks and certainly the Orthodox community. But is that a fair assessment? I mean, do you feel as though there are a lot of people out there within your community who are taking part in this and who are very concerned about what happens next?
I think it's fair to say, Melanie, and it's very good to see you and good to join you again and this great panel of faith leaders. Thank you. It's fair to say that there was a time when the relationship between the Jewish community and its leaders and Black leaders was in the news and made extraordinary strides to improve relationships. I have to say that much of our work today has been going on, but it hasn't been observed or seen or felt. And I think that's the area, as we've spoken so often this past week and in recent times about seizing the moment. This is a turning point, a watershed. This is a time for all of us to continue to listen and hear each other, but to be profoundly compelled to make a difference with each other. And as Cardinal said, and in Genesis we read, we're all created in God's image. We also read the same text, love your neighbor as yourself. But what I've also come to learn is that before we can truly love each other, as tradition would encourage us to do in the most ideal sense, we also have to understand each other's pain. And if we understand each other's pain, then we can truly know how to avoid it, how to help someone overcome it, and then know mutual love. I was asked what I thought when I attended the funeral for Mr. Floyd at the church. And I will tell you, I went to grieve with them and with a grieving nation so that I could feel, understand, and express my condolences and the pain. And now to turn the corner and to demonstrate love that is evident in our community and between our communities. And I think there is so much more for us to become together.
But then that brings me to the question that all of you have been asked, and I'll let you know in just a moment that I've had a couple of questions from our viewers out there. And that is, what happens next? So, Rabbi, what is your message to your members? That it's one thing to grieve at home and to love your neighbor silently, but what's the next step?
That is the question of the day. And in my sermon on Friday night, when we gather to begin the Sabbath, I said to the congregation that though the Jewish community has known in its history and in this country its own sense of persecution and oppression, the strides that we have made do not give us any privilege to relax in our own effort to help everybody rise to where they can be. And therefore, we do have committee and structure within the Jewish community. Every synagogue in Houston is engaged in social justice work, but it is time to ramp it up and to get to know the fine people on this panel better, and other church and imams and other significant leaders, and we're doing it. You'll hear more tonight, I think, about some of the efforts that we're doing jointly. But the synagogues, I've been on more Zoom calls this week than ever before to collaborate with rabbis and other faith leaders to be sure that we are in the right place at the right time, because now there's no time to waste.
And you mentioned that. I want to go to the Imam right now, Imam Shah, because I know that there was a group of Imams who got together and sent a letter, and then I think about the same time a group of Jewish leaders who sent a letter and asked, and I'm trying to remember all the specifics, but basically said that it was important for you all to work together and for our city to work together. Is that fairly accurate?
Absolutely. First, I want to say thank you to you and all of the distinguished leaders, faith leaders present here today. And thank you for including us and in this important discussion or this important conversation. I believe that, Muslim community is also a very important part of society and of this community specifically. And yes, we have had huge struggles, as many are already aware of, but this is a time for us to stand in solidarity, to come together with our brethren, with our Black brothers and sisters of the community. And yes, we are trying to do whatever we can. So if you know a little bit about the Muslim community's history in the United States, we're not fairly old, we're quite young. We are into just transitioning into the third generation phase. So now, just recently, we have started revamping and empowering our interfaith, our outreach, our social services initiatives. Although not to say that when it comes to Islam and Muslims, that's not the case. That's always been the case. But when we had the first, second generation coming over here, now we were focused more on religious services. But now, if we were to look at the data, the Muslim community also consists 20% of the Muslim community is the Black community. So that is a huge number among us. So we cannot just say that the Black community is part of us. And, a great figure, Malcolm X, who was also a Muslim, and he was part of the civil rights movement and he had his great role that he played in history. Muhammad Ali was another figure, and many. So we are doing our part, and yes, we are together with the community, because we are also at times become victims of many things. But
I was going to say, your community is very much targeted, so you certainly understand discrimination. We all know, how Muslims have often been treated in this country, especially after 9/11 and the wars in the Middle East. And we also know that you've suffered some violence that has been committed against your mosque and the like. Even some elected officials have targeted the Muslim community. We remember the ban just several years ago on Muslims entering the country. So I guess that is the other part I have to ask you. Do you sometimes worry that there but for the grace of God go we? And as a result, perhaps feel as though either you should be more involved with the Black community as a result of that, or perhaps a little bit less, and maybe you can clarify for me.
No, that's actually a very good point you brought up. I think that, yes, we have been a target of many things, including hate and prejudice, and not just all over the country, but there are examples here in our city as well. No, we definitely need to get more involved. And, just as I mentioned earlier before, that the 20% of Muslim community consists of Blacks. So it's not to say that whether do we engage with a huge number of Black Americans are Muslims. They are part of our culture. They're part of our mosque. They're part of our center. So yes, we need to get engaged, involved, empower, educate, and learn ourselves, because many Muslims, it can be said that they are from, Middle East or Asia. So a lot of times, now another challenge is that many of those who have never faced or this slavery or this type of racism, they don't know what it feels like. They have no idea. They don't know what supremacy or privilege is. It's a completely different thing. And we being forced into something without your will, without any choice, and being subjugated to many things that are completely inhumane. So yes, I think not just Islam, but all of our faith and all of our religions and all of our teachings teach us to stand up for that, hold firm justice, as the Quran says in chapter number 4, Kunu qawwamina bil qisti shuhada, that uphold and stand firm with justice, even if it be against yourself, even if it be against your parents, even if it be against your relatives.
Yeah.
So yes, we are trying to do our part, and I'm glad to be part of this amazing panelist, this group of faith leaders, and thank you.
Well, we are glad to have you here. I'm going to take a slight detour and move away from the clergy for a moment and talk to the sheriff. And Sheriff, I want to bring you in on this because there is obviously the issue of bias that still hangs over virtually every law enforcement agency there is out there. And as a result, you're a person of color. You've worked now for the Houston Police Department as well as for the Sheriff's Department. So you know firsthand how things happen behind the scenes with officers, and officers sometimes who may target Black and brown communities or over-police their neighborhoods. So what do you do now that you're at the top of the food chain? How do you turn that around? And how does it make you feel when you hear, for instance, a Black mother or parent or wife say, I'm afraid to have my husband walk outside the door or send my son on an errand in the car or even have, my kids playing out in front of the house? How does that make you feel?
Well, Melanie, first of all, thank you and ABC13 for hosting this very critical conversation. I'm honored to be on this panel with so many amazing leaders from our community. It really is a privilege. First, my condolences continue to go out to the Floyd family. What happened was tragic to see Mr. Floyd be murdered at the hands of police. And, for me, as a Latino man, my memory takes me to when I was just a young kid, being a native Houstonian here in my very own community, when we saw the riots break out in 1978 after the incident involving the death of Joe Campos Torres in 1977 at the hands of police here locally. And I remember seeing those images on TV, not fully understanding the full scope of what happened. But fast forward now, little did I know that I would be now in a leading role, leading one of the largest police agencies in the country, and really feeling the need to make sure that I'm helping take my chosen profession in a better direction and making sure that these incidents don't continue to occur. But what happened to Mr. Floyd, sadly, is playing out far too often across our nation. We're seeing a lot of encounters between police and members of minority communities, especially with Black men, turn deadly, and that has to change. And I think that what I hope is that we just don't see cosmetic changes, but we need serious change to really occur. We need to make sure that we use this moment as an opportunity to come together to stand in unity and solidarity against racism of any kind, not only in policing. Racist policing has no place in American society. We must root it out, and we must also make sure that we come to grips with the racist origins of the profession. We've got to understand how we got here. We got to understand about the slave patrols and Jim Crow and how police historically was used. And also as police leaders, that we have to understand how we contribute to over-policing in communities, especially communities of color. We've got to make sure that we're listening, that we're paying attention to it. But I also want to challenge everybody that we not only stop looking at policing in terms of the front of the house, sort of what comes out on the body-worn cameras, the engagements between police and community. There's a lot of other systems that need to change. I operate the second largest jail system in the country, and it bothers me to no end that 50% of my jail population today here in Harris County is 50% Black males. 50% out of a population of 8,200 individuals, and about 60 or 70% are just pretrial individuals. Now, I don't have an exact answer to that, but we got to be willing to have that conversation. Every year here in our community, 90,000 children have a parent that's incarcerated in our jail. I'm doing something about that, but where's the rest of the community? We got to make sure that we look at systemic racism and systems that are set up that aren't truly helping all communities, especially minorities communities. We've got to make sure that once and for all, we embrace the notion that Black lives matter, that our Black brothers and sisters are not expendable, that I as a Latino male can stand in solidarity with them and at the same time support law enforcement, that I can have a voice to help educate and help educate individuals about what policing is about, the things that we get right and the things that we get wrong. We've got to make sure that we understand that just because we understand that certain cases may be under investigation doesn't mean that the community has trust in those systems that have been set up to try to bring police accountability. And so we got to make sure that we're part of this discussion as well, that we don't become offended because people are marching, that people are calling us names, that people want change. We need to embrace that. We need to understand that the anger and hurt is real and that it's justified. And then we also have to see where we could help change some of that narrative where it is possible and not forget the many positive changes that have occurred. Many positive changes.
But Sheriff, you're the guy at the top now. You are the person who is in charge. What do you do about officers within your force that perhaps have had one or two problems, more than that? What are you doing to root out bad cops?
Well, the key thing is we hold them accountable. When it's appropriate, we seek or move to terminate them. We have no room for that in our agency. We have a lot of policies. We're revising our policies even more to make sure that we have the right protocols in place. We review our training. But as the old saying goes, is culture eats training for breakfast. We got to make sure that we don't only have nicely written protocols and rules in place, but that officers and deputies are actually following those, that they know that they will be held accountable. What I saw in Minneapolis was one primary individual was the focus that seemed to be callous and indifferent to what was going on, but there were several others that didn't intervene, that didn't step in, even though they had a duty to do it, and didn't do it. So we got to make sure that our culture dictates that the others will also be held accountable, that we look at issues that are much broader than the power that I can have, because there are civil service protections in many police agencies across the country that do protect officers. And look, many of those protections are valid and necessary. We want to make sure that those protections are in place. But at the same time, when somebody does something wrong, even as a profession, we must be able to move quickly to get them off our force, to pursue criminal charges, and make sure that they're not going to serve in this profession anymore, whether it be with my agency or another one down the street or somewhere else in another state. So some rules do need to change, but we also have to make sure to say, are we doing enough? Can we change the over-policing? Can we change our training at the academy to not be so militaristic, but also reinforce that we are guardians of the community? In many ways, we've forgotten that we're meant to protect and serve. Protect and serve. It's not us against the community. It's us with the community to protect them. And I, as a police executive, have invested a lot of my resources to make sure that we are offering those support services. Look, policing in America, we're called to be in the front lines of three important issues: mental illness, addiction, and poverty. Those should be community-based responses, not a police response, but somehow we've inherited those duties, and we're not the best. We could have a role in that, but we're not the best to deliver that. We should be looking at public health models for that and investments in the community to address that, like we're doing now with the opioid epidemic. We should have done it with the war on drugs when we had the crack epidemic, but instead we have we criminalized it, and we sent a lot of men to prison over the war on drugs. That's got to change.
So you wouldn't mind giving up some of your budget, for instance, for other social agencies that do deal with some of those issues you're talking about, like mental health and homelessness and the like. You wouldn't mind doing that?
I would not mind. We're doing it now. I don't like I believe that the narrative or the branding of defund police. We've heard some movements to abolish police. I don't believe that's the right terminology to use or to be going in the direction. But we should not be distracted by the language that's being used. I think where it's appropriate and it makes sense, if there's a community-based organization that can better serve those vulnerable communities, great, let them do it. But also, don't just pull money away from law enforcement if we're doing something very well. We have some programs that are battle-tested, that are evidence-based, that are making a huge difference to the community. We have programs right now that support and mentor, children that have a parent that's incarcerated in our jail. Nobody else is really doing that. There's ministries, and we appreciate Fountains of Praise and others that are investing in that, but we're also doing that work in-house. And so it doesn't have to be one size fits all. There's room for everybody to do it. But if we could redirect some of the funding that we have to help the community, then we're open to that discussion. And I want to be part of the solution. I don't want to be part of the problem.
And that's what we want to talk about tonight. But real quickly before I let you go, and this is a quick yes or no, how do you feel about releasing body cam video?
When we had a controversial incident that happened a couple years back, it was a result of deadly force. I released that video. I believe it was within 2 days of the incident. So I'm a big believer in transparency. I know there's a lot of other nuance to that. We've got to work to make sure there's a successful prosecution. But nowadays, everything's filmed. And look, the truth of the matter is these incidents have happened for many, many years. From the beginning of time, they just simply weren't filmed, you know. And we got to speak the truth on that. And so
now we're seeing.
Yeah, and now all these situations have been filmed, you know. So it's a part of reality. We've got to. The information belongs to the community. They deserve to be transparent. So we're going to refine our policy, but my goal would be to release video within 30 to 45 days. Obviously, we have to consult with the DA's office on that as well. We'll firm up our policies. But historically, I've shown that whenever we had a video in a controversial situation, we released it, I believe, within 2 days. That's probably a little too fast, to be honest with you. But somewhere within 30 to 45 days should be a reasonable time, I think, that we should be considering seriously releasing it. I can only speak for my...
Well, we appreciate that very much, Sheriff. And I want to get back now to some of our religious leaders and to talk about their relationship with you and other law enforcement agencies. But Bishop Dickson, I know you kind of snuck in here, and I'm glad to have you here, as a matter of fact. You held a rally yesterday for clergy, urging Houstonians to rally against racism and against police brutality. And why, I guess this is kind of the overall question really for everybody here, but why do you think religious institutions should get involved with the entire issue that has been raised by these protests? It is an issue that Black churches have dealt with really since slavery almost, but why do you think this is so critical, and how do you get others involved?
Well, first, Melanie, thank you very much for having me on with this auspicious group of faith leaders and law enforcement. I'm honored to be named amongst them tonight, and so thank you for the opportunity. And to all of you, fellow clergy, good evening to you. I think that, as you just mentioned, the first premise, of course, is biblical. The scripture does say in Genesis, God created man in his own image and likeness, and we know that could not be an exterior description because we don't know God's exterior description. He's spirit. And so we're dealing with the spirit of human beings. All of us are made in that same image and likeness, the Imago Dei, and that is a theological premise that all of our faith groups do purport. And so that's equality in essence. Acts chapter 17 in the Christian scripture, 17:26 says, of one blood God created all mankind, humankind, which makes us one family. We think that's important. Racism is built on a false premise, and that false premise suggests that there's more than one race. There could not be racial superiority if there's not at least the concept of at least two or more races. That is where the fault line is. There's truly only one race. That's the human race. If we ever could come back to that original theological truth, then there is no grounds for racism or supremacy or inferiority at all, because we are truly of one essence and we're one family. And Dr. King said wisely, we'll either learn to live together as brothers or we'll perish together as fools. And so theologically, we are really one family. Historically, of course, the Black church comes out of the protests. We were not wanted in the church that existed coming out of slavery. And so the Black church was active birth in this crisis, in the womb of crisis. And we have been forever saying we cannot breathe. Historically and culturally, for 400 years, Blacks in America have been saying we can't breathe. We can't breathe on the slave ships, on the bottom of boats. We can't breathe through 250 plus years of slavery and all that entailed. We can't breathe. The adverse responses to Reconstruction, of course, became Jim Crow. We can't breathe segregation. We can't breathe through the lynchings, and on and on. So the knee of oppression has been on the necks of Black America for 400 years. The imagery that we saw with the officer on George Floyd's neck is an image of something bigger. The picture of oppression on the necks of a people for 400 years. And just think of it, that with the knee of oppression on our necks, we produced a Melanie Lawson, a Michael Jordan, a Tiger Woods. We produced scientists, we produced engineers and doctors. Absolutely. But can you imagine what we would have produced over these last 400 years, 200 years, if we have not had this knee of oppression on our neck constantly suffocating us? So it is our motif. The faith message from a biblical perspective is a liberation message. Without liberation, there's no salvation. Without salvation, there's no liberation. They're one and the same. We've got to preach that gospel and practice it as well.
Well, Bishop, I know that in the past you've worked a lot with other Black organizations, other Black churches, but you have really reached out this time around to people of all colors and all backgrounds. Why was that so important this time? What is different?
Well, I'm so honored to answer that question. We have tried this in times past, and just for whatever reason, we're not able to galvanize. But the eyes of the nation are now open, and hearts have opened up at the same time. And there's the will, the collective will to unite. And so to have the imams there, to have the rabbis there, to have individuals, Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Gentile, it's what Dr. King talked about over 50 years ago, all of us at the table of brotherhood, because unless we do this together as a family, we cannot move forward to heal. Reconciliation requires everyone at the table. You got to confront something to cure it. You got to be transparent in order to transform, and you have to unite in mass as one family in order to move family as a heal force. We're building a human love force that's empowered to liberate the oppressed and to eradicate racism together. And when we speak that same message with one voice, there's no power greater than unity, because there God commands the blessing. So I'm honored to be a part of that coalition and have our faith leaders as well as others of diverse cultures and ethnicities who are all a part of the same mission. That's what the model has been with Pope Lawson. I call him Pope Lawson, affected Dr. Lawson, and with Bishop Fiorenza, as well as with Rabbi Karf, and now with Cardinal DiNardo and others. If we can follow that model and multiply it in mass, there's no force that can keep us from bringing change to America.
All right. And in just a moment, I want us to come back and talk about what happens now. But I do want to go to Reverend Bill Lawson. And if I slip and call you Daddy, please forgive me for that, everybody. But I do want to ask you about the civil rights movement, which you were so much a part of in Houston, Texas, back in the 60s and in the era of MLK. It started in churches. It was built by churches. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, was all about churches. What do you think the difference is now? As you look at all of these marches, you were at the protest several weeks ago, you were at the funeral. What is so different now?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you. For at least.
Hold on a second, Reverend Bill. We don't hear you very well. Let's see if, why don't you start up again, because we don't want to miss out. Okay, this is when I say, Daddy, can you say a couple of words?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you a little bit better. Go ahead. But yeah, try it again and talk a little bit about the history and what it was like in Houston, Texas in the 1960s when you did these protests. Talk about that.
I was in the process of thanking you and ABC13 for allowing this conversation to be aired. I think that is very important for us to at least face these issues, to talk about these issues, and then to raise the question, where do we go from here? You asked me about the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. I think that just about everybody at least knows whether you've read about it or whether you've probably lived through it, realizes that the civil rights movement was an anti-segregation movement. It was a movement that faced the fact that we couldn't sit on the front of the bus, or we couldn't go into a store and try shoes, or we had to go to black schools or black churches. And so our primary thrust in those days was black against segregation. And we marched and we demonstrated and we made speeches against Jim Crow. That's largely what we fought against. I think as I look at what I saw in the rally in Houston, and I think in the marches almost every place, it is an extremely diverse group. These are not just blacks appealing against segregation, but these are people feeling as though our nation is wounded. And as Bishop Dixon has said, we have had a neck on our knee. And so there are many people who felt like that. Females have felt like that. Other minorities have felt like that. And what we saw in these rallies and marches was a whole rain stream, rain dream, but a whole rainbow of people who thought that the nation needs to recognize that we have a problem, a serious problem, and that we need to deal with that problem. So I think that what was different in the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and the protests of this time is that people are not just marching against one single evil, segregation, that we are recognizing that there is corruption in almost all of our institutions, and that corruption needs to be faced and needs to be addressed, and then something needs to be done about it. My question would be likewise, where do we go from here? We've had our marches and we've had our rallies and now we've ended up with anger. What you have on this panel is a rainbow, and this suggests that they're not just blacks concerned about this, even though part of the reason why we are rallying and marching and making speeches is because we've had black people who have been assassinated, and the question is, where do we go from here? The easiest thing is to say anger, and that makes good sense. If your father or your brother or your husband had been assassinated, certainly by law enforcement, anger is the logical response. My question would be, after having watched this kind of response for a long time, is that anger, revenge, is a very shallow comfort. It doesn't do much. If we say what we need to do is to break some bones and knock out some teeth, that really doesn't help much. But just the fact that we've got Catholics and Protestants and Muslims and Jews all on this panel is to suggest that we have to go further than just simple anger. And my hope is that we will realize that our problem is not legal. Our problem is far more moral.
Far more moral. Yeah, that's a good place to jump off. And can I ask you quickly, do you feel more hopeful now as you look at this coalition? Because you've told me that this is unlike anything you've seen before. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. And I do feel a lot more hopeful. Just the fact that we can have people such as the ones who are on this panel suggest that there's a much broader response. And I think that as I look at this response, that we're probably moving closer to a time when 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 we will have a national response.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, so rather than me trying to give you all very, pat questions, I'm hoping we can open up the conversation a little bit. And I want to bring it to a head by sort of telling you what a couple of the questions I got from viewers were. One was, this is from an 18-year-old student, Adam, from Harris County, who was a college student. And he said his question is for the Cardinal. How do you plan on helping millions of parishioners understand the different forms of racism in our society? And then at the other end of the age spectrum, Ralph 76 from Houston says, the chaos in today's world, I believe, has been brought about the lack of God in this great country. So as a panel of different segments of society, what are you really going to do to address this problem? And that is our bottom line here. Everybody wants to know. We've marched, we've talked, we've, been angry, we've, there have been riots, all the like. But as they look at you, as they look at this quilt here, what's next? What do we do? And I'm going to allow any one of you to jump in first of all and see if we can't have a real conversation about that. Surely you're not usually this polite. Cardinal, did you want to jump in since that question was aimed at you? Yes.
To the 18-year-old who has written in, thank you for listening. And I don't want to answer that so much as I want we to answer it. Within all of our churches, the first is to get the conversation going amongst our own parishioners. Houston is the United Nations. Even all of us together are still but one small part. Bishop Dickson is right. We are one race, the human race, and the variety is enriching. So we need to speak with one another and in our own communities, because there are differences there, so we may be enriched. We start this by dealing with enrichment. May I also add one comment to Sheriff? Thank you very much. I believe we should walk with the police, not walk against them, walk with them. I also think we should occasionally confront them. There might be a civil or civic way in which that can be done. That's just simply a suggestion.
Well, Cardinal, I have to ask you the same thing I asked my dad. Are you more hopeful now? You've certainly seen many permutations of this issue.
I'm very hopeful because it's out in the open. Unless something is recognized and stated and it remains under the table, it always, has a manner of not going away. This is when you confront it. So I'm very hopeful.
Melanie, I can say that I'm hopeful if, in fact, the system responds and reacts in a way conducive to what's going on. And by that I mean, with what happened to George Floyd, if in fact, we look up and see that there's not any kind of conviction, we go right back where we were. I just happened today to be listening to Marvin Gaye's song, What's Going On? And I noticed how he talked about back in the 60s, what's happening today. And there's Bible for that. As a matter of fact, Isaiah 59 and 14, he says, and judgment has turned away backward, and justice standeth afar off. For truth is fallen in the streets, and equity cannot enter. And that's what we're looking at right now. He goes on to say, and the Lord was displeased that there was no judgment. I think that what we can do moving forward, we can inform, we can inspire, and then we can empower. We've got to let in our churches, our people know information about what's going on, how to handle themselves if they're stopped by the police, how we can connect with local government officials so that we can see to it that people know the police in their communities. But then also we've got to continue to inspire by preaching messages that are messages that go beyond pie in the sky, sweet by and by. They have to be messages that talk about empowering down here. And that's the thing that we have to. Mia and I have raised 4 young black boys. Thank God all of them are successful. But when they're out on the streets at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock at night, it's the same situation. It's the same situation. They're just black men out on the street. And so we have to really do something about making sure that the system, because there's layers of systemic racism that goes just beyond policing. It's education, it's health, We're living with food deserts all around us. It's socioeconomic, where you can't get a decent loan, or you can't get a decent interest rate. Those are all issues that we've got to speak to.
Melanie, thank you for taking this hard task of having the conversation. But I want to add to this. I'm extremely hopeful. We had a personal situation that happened in our area, and I had several neighbors send a response back, but it was a 16-year-old girl who responded back to me with a message of thank you for pointing out the racism and the implicit bias that was in the email. And it was just the fact that a 16-year-old, she was Asian, young girl would see that in my email without me using those exact words. She saw what I was calling out, even in my own neighborhood. And so we have to learn to stand up. We have to see what is happening in our world. As Pastor Wright said about the systems that are in place, there's systemic racism that is deeply rooted. I believe Pastor Wells said we have to look at what the history of some of these things are and how we have used even the Bible itself to control people, to keep people and to reinforce one race over another, how we've built social constructs of race itself. As Bishop Dickson said, we've built this construct to make it so that it's easy to treat somebody less than you are, so that you can build and say that your race is superior. But in fact, we are one human race. And so we come together. I say to people all the time, if Blacks could have solved the problems caused by racism alone, we would have done this years ago. We could not do it by ourselves. We cannot do it by ourselves. It will take the co-joining of people who are white, who are Hispanic, who are Asian, who are immigrants, who are born here, people who come together and say, we want to see a world that is truly unified. In order for that to happen, and it can happen, I am hopeful. I am hopeful, certainly for this next generation as well, but I'm truly hopeful that it can happen in our generation, to see the systems that are in place to begin to break down, to be challenged, to be held accountable, so that we indeed move forward as one people in the United States of America.
But again, you are churches, you are synagogues, you're mosques, as opposed to an official structure of some sort or another. Rabbi and Imam, I'm going to come to you all now. Do you feel as though you could pick up the phone and call the sheriff's office in the midst of some event? Do you feel as though it is possible for you to rush to each other's aid in the event of some kind of terrible situation developing out there?
Yes, Melanie, without a doubt. In fact, it's this week that really brought it all to a head, so that Bishop Dixon and I were on the phone together and getting to know each other better. Pastor Wells and I were always friends and talking to each other. And I think that with respect to faith, I'm so glad that so many young people are tuning in to see all of us, how privileged we are to have young people listening to this panel of faith leaders and others. But if we only light candles and only drink wine and only utter prayers, but don't get on to the work that needs to be done, then religion is an armor that protects us from each other. But in fact, it should be something that compels us to get into the ills and the needs of the world and make the difference that makes not only each other proud, but makes our God proud too.
But when you say get in there and do the work, what do you mean? How tomorrow, and really, again, anybody can jump in here, how tomorrow do you go out and make change? What are we doing now that is different from, last week, last year?
Melanie, if I can jump in there.
I'm sorry. Please do.
That's right.
And I'm not sure
what I was going to say is
Pastor Wells and then Bishop Dickson. Go ahead, Pastor.
Part of what we have to do is say, look, we don't have to agree about everything to work on something. We don't have to, and knowing that there are a world of things wrong doesn't mean we can't pick one of them. There are lots of things that are wrong. When we talk about Black Lives Matter being a part of All Lives Matter, my brother-in-law is a firefighter. And he'll tell you all houses matter, but they only send the trucks to the houses that are on fire. Right now there's a fire. And so, Rabbi Lyon has spoken at my church. I've spoken at his synagogue. We've been friends for a long time. It's no surprise we disagree about things. So we don't focus on the things we disagree about. 7 years ago, when payday lending was really beginning to rear its head in a new way, Rabbi Lyon and the Cardinal and I were instrumental in working with the city to pass legislation to try to curb payday lending in the way that we can at a municipal level. I think when you start to recognize there's this problem, and we all agree this is a problem, racism is a problem. It's America's original sin. But if we'll choose to come together around that and push off the other things and say, we can make a difference here, then there's a meeting of the minds. And I think there is a value to a moral voice. That's part of why you've assembled this panel. That's a voice that the business community listens to. It's a voice that our politicians listen to. And part of what is so surprising about that voice is when there is such unity among Muslims and Jews and Protestants and Catholics and white churches and black churches and Hispanic churches and Asian churches, there is the sense that God is at work in the world around us. And we get to be a part of that. That's part of the hardship of leadership, is to take on that stewardship of these kinds of moments.
And I know Bishop Dickson wanted to say a quick word. Yes, Bishop.
No, very well said, Pastor Steve and Rabbi as well.
Thank you, Bishop.
I think that we've got to move from anger to agenda. And an agenda is very important. And what's really good about these dialogues is to work together. First, we got to listen, we have to learn. And that's how we express our love for each other. If I'm in pain, you have to listen and learn. And then as we're learning and we work together, we can do better together. Let me mention a couple of things. One, racism is in education. Identifying what's missing in education for African American and other minority youth. That's got to be an agenda around that. Why is it that black schools, urban schools are less funded? Why are those buildings dilapidated? Why are those programs suffering? An agenda around systemic racism in the educational system. That's what with One Family, One Future, we're working on an agenda that deals with racism in education, racism in mass incarceration. The 13th Amendment of our Constitution legalizes free labor when you are in prison. That was the way to legalize slavery, through the prison system. Most people don't understand that the Constitution supports that. There are over $10 billion per year generated for for-profit American companies on free prison labor. So you got blacks and other minorities working for for-profit companies for free while they're incarcerated, but it's legal because it's under the banner of prison. So when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution legalized slavery under the banner of incarceration. Most people don't know that, but we've got to teach that, then understand that's why the war on drugs, as it was mentioned earlier, the war on drugs was about getting more people in prison. That's why crack, as the sheriff mentioned, was a crime and opioids is a sickness, because it was about incarcerating more and more people. That's what mass incarceration is about. That's racism in incarceration. Then there's racism in financing. Think about it, that in the 1950s, when the Fair Housing Act was signed, the home ownership for blacks today is almost synonymous to what it was when that Fair Housing Act was signed. Why? Because there's racism in systemic financing. So we got to dig down under the weeds and develop an agenda. In this county, we're still dealing with, as the sheriff said, people are in jail, not because they have been convicted of a crime, but because it's pre-trial. But they can't afford to get out. They don't have bonding money. And so we understand those kind of agenda items. If we can unite around a movement like One Family, One Future or something else, we're asking One Family, One Future, we can have an agenda that all of us would weigh into, leverage our resources and our influence to see systemic change, one agenda item at a time. And we finally have the muscle to do it as a unit.
All right, Bishop, we're running a few minutes over, so I want to make sure I get everybody's final words in here. Imam, I want to ask you, do you feel as though if something happens in your mosque, if something happens to someone, you can pick up the phone and call the sheriff, or you can call one of the other members of this panel? Do you feel as though perhaps that's changed in the last few weeks?
Yes, absolutely. So I just want to add 2 points over here, and I know that we're already over time. To answer this question, yes, absolutely. We are very hopeful, and we are in very good terms with the sheriff department, with the police department, with the law enforcement agencies, with the government, city officials. And we feel very confident. We have very good relationship. We invite them. They come over. When you don't really know someone and all you hear about them on the media, on what everybody else is saying about that person, and they give you that picture, or he's like that, or they're like that. But when you actually meet them and you get to know them, then you find out that, hey, they're just like us. They have the same issues as us. Then you know that we're all the same. Yes, we may have differences. We may agree on certain things, but that does not mean that we come to points of contention that affect all of us as a humanity. And the second point that I want to share with you, and I think I'll just conclude, and I know we're over time, is that yes, where do we go from here? And that was an excellent point that were brought up by, I think, the Cardinal, the Reverend Lawson, and everyone present here today. And I mentioned this in my sermon last week when I was giving the Friday sermon, that yes, we put up statements, we make a post, and we post pictures, and yes, we use the hashtag, but what are we doing? Where do we go? What happens now, right? Okay.
Yeah, what does happen now?
Yeah, what does happen now? So what I said, that we start from an individual person. We make sure that, Muslim community is a very diverse community. It consists of blacks, whites, Africans, Asians, Middle Eastern. So yes, there can be a little bit of racism when you have such a diverse group. So what we've addressed is make sure that there is no form of racism within your community, within your family, right? Make sure that, because we have intermarriages, make sure there's no form of racism. Or when you see an incident like this, you don't just sit in the comfort of your home. You come out and you do something about it. You speak against it. And I can tell you for a fact that the Muslim community did come out, and we will come out. Every time there is a need and every time there is an injustice that is done, we will come out for our brothers and sisters. We are always against injustice, oppression. We know what it feels like, and we will be with you, with the community, every step of the way.
All right, thank you so much, Imam. I'm going to give 30 seconds each to Reverend Lawson, and then to the Cardinal, and finally the Sheriff. So Reverend Lawson, you get to start. You've certainly watched many of these cycles in your lifetime. What do you see as the most important thing to do now?
The first thing to do is just what you're doing right now. Questions. You need to raise questions. The second thing is, we need to start answering some of those questions. I believe that at this point, we need to work on things like better policing, and the sheriff has mentioned that already. But I think that we need to work on better policing. But then secondly, I think that we need to come up with some positive way of showing love. It is a fairly easy thing to show anger, but how you show love? I think that's a question that needs to be answered. Now let me let you pass it on to somebody.
Well, I'm going to pass it on to the Cardinal, as we have watched this extraordinary last few weeks, Cardinal, and I know many of your members are involved as well. But what do you do next? What do you do with your huge archdiocese in terms of turning people in a more positive direction, in the sense that they can accomplish something?
Well, 30 seconds, I'll say it this way. Turn your anger and your desires and your intelligence into prayer. And once you have done that, then you come out of that prayer and you think of one action that is necessary in your community. I think within the community of Houston right now, a major action that's necessary is to work on education. And I would, for one, say to any of my congregations or any people who are around, bring your help, bring your thought to an education facility, or to educating children or being with children. That's my 30 seconds.
All right. Thank you so much, Cardinal. And Sheriff, I'm going to ask you, you're here with this august body of clergy. And obviously we are talking about some tragic and really horrendous events that have happened over the last few weeks. But what do you hope to take out of all of this? And are you willing to pick up the phone and call them? And hopefully they're willing to pick up the phone and call you.
Yes, absolutely. I have a great deal of admiration and respect for everyone on the panel. Bishop Dixon, for example, has been very instrumental in helping us lead efforts to better support, as I mentioned earlier, those children that have a parent that's incarcerated in our county jail. And we have a lot of work to do. And I just want to encourage everyone that may be tuning in to make sure that they're voting, that they're getting involved. There's political decisions around many of the issues that we talked about here today. We need an engaged community that not only is willing to speak about critical issues, but to cast their vote because elections matter. We also have to make sure that we're not using law and order, because I hear that quite a bit. We can't use law and order as an excuse for brutality. That's got to change. Internally, we got to look at our agencies to see how we train, how we recruit, how we're hiring, our hiring practices. We got to make sure that when somebody is committing criminal activity, that as police executives, we take quick action when the evidence supports it, that we get rid of bad apples. I hate using that term bad apples because we hear, well, there's only a few bad apples. In our profession, we can't afford one bad apple. We got to get that corrected. But I also want to be hopeful because I know that the men and women that serve in law enforcement, vast majority care about serving the community. They want to make a difference. It's still a noble profession, I believe. I believe they should be better paid along with educators. But we've got to make sure that we're willing to do the work, put in the work to change our profession, make sure it's going in the right direction. We need to listen to the cries from the community, that pain from the community. It hurts me when I hear a black mother or father said, yeah, I've had that talk with my son. That shouldn't happen in America today. It shouldn't happen in our community. People should not be afraid of how their community is going to be policed or to
So what are you going to do tomorrow to turn that around?
Well, we're already doing that. We're taking a deep look. We're going to see how we could bring more focus into procedural policing here in the Harris County Sheriff's Office, how we're hiring and recruiting and how we're training. We're looking at our policies to make sure that they're not only correct legally, but that we're also clearly emphasizing the de-escalation part of it, not only embedded, but it needs to be front and center, protecting the sanctity of life. I'm looking at myself in my capacity as a leader because the buck stops with me. I've got to be willing to look at myself to see how am I contributing to my organization not doing better. I can't just put the blame on the frontline deputies that are out there doing the job. It has to start with me as well. And I'm willing to look in the mirror and see how I can do better, how I can prepare myself as a better leader. My Catholic perspective, my studies at the University of St. Thomas, where I graduated from, my master's degree, taught me about the communitarian perspective, that the power of community relationships, and how we can lead on social justice. All those issues are so important in helping educate and leading my work going forward. And because I always say when I walk through the jail and I look at the population, 70% black and brown, that there but for the grace of God go I. And even though we believe in equality for all, the statistics don't always bear that out. Because I would be more likely to be incarcerated in the county jail than to ever be the sheriff. But here I am because I stand on the shoulders of great leaders, such as Rev Bill Lawson and many others that opened the way for others to step forward and be able to lead. And so I want to maximize this moment in time. Every day I'm blessed to have 86,400 seconds to be able to make a difference in my community, in my agency. And I don't want to miss a thing. I want to make sure that I'm helping lead the Harris County Sheriff's Office in a better place, my county, my city, and my profession in a better place. That's my commitment. That's what I want to do, and that's what I want to do. And I'm also proud of the men and women of our corrections team and in policing that work so hard every day to protect our community.
Well, Sheriff, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank our entire panel. I know since I'm among a bunch of clergy that I let the service run too long, and I apologize for that to all of you as well as to our audience. But I appreciate your very thoughtful and profound interactions and observations. And I believe that we really are going to make this city a much better place as a result of conversations like this. Thank you so much for being with us. We want to thank as well all of you who tuned in tonight to watch this. And have a great evening, everybody. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.
Remind your viewers to complete the census as well. We're going
Oh,
to
all right.
Fill out that census.
To vote and complete